April 5th, 1945. 0500 hours. The Apuan Alps of northern Italy. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker crouched in the pre-dawn darkness at the base of a fortified German mountain strongpoint called Castle Aghinolfi. He was 25 years old. He weighed 140 pounds. He stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. Behind him, 25 men waited for his signal. Most were green replacements who had never fired a shot in combat. Above him, dug into the hillside, the Germans had built a network of concrete machine gun nests, observation posts, and reinforced dugouts that had already destroyed 3 previous Allied assaults with heavy losses. The soldiers who fought here had given the area a name. They called it the Triangle of Death. Baker was a black officer in a segregated army, leading men his own country considered unfit to fight. 4 years earlier, a recruiting sergeant had looked him in the face and told him there were no quotas for his people. Now he was 2 miles behind German lines, alone at the front of a weapons platoon, about to do something that would take 52 years for his country to acknowledge. If you want to understand how a man the United States Army did not want became the most decorated black soldier of the Second World War, you need to start in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Vernon Joseph Baker was born on December 17, 1919. He was the youngest of 3 children. His father was Manuel Caldera. His mother was Beulah Baker. When Vernon was 4 years old, both his parents were killed in a car accident. The boy who would one day storm a German fortress alone was orphaned before he could form a clear memory of his mother's face. He and his 2 sisters, Irma and Cass, were sent to live with their paternal grandparents, Joseph S. Baker and Dora Baker, in Cheyenne. There were roughly a dozen black families in the entire town. Vernon grew up as an outsider in a place that had almost no room for him. The few black children in Cheyenne learned early that certain streets, certain stores, certain playgrounds were not for them. Vernon learned this before he learned to read. His grandfather, Joseph, was the chief brakeman for the Union Pacific Railroad. He was the most important person in Vernon's life. A quiet, disciplined man who worked 16-hour shifts, coupling and uncoupling rail cars in the Wyoming cold, and expected the same toughness from his grandson. Joseph Baker gave Vernon his first rifle at age 12. The rule was simple. Every bullet fired must bring home meat for the family. No wasted shots, no target practice for fun. Every single round counted. If Vernon came home with an empty magazine and nothing to show for it, there were consequences. He learned to shoot the way a surgeon learns to cut, with precision, with purpose, with no margin for error. 1 shot, 1 kill. That was not a military slogan to Vernon Baker. It was how he fed his family at 12 years old. His grandfather also gave him another lesson, one that had nothing to do with rifles. Joseph Baker told his grandson that if he wanted to live, he needed to learn how to conform. It was not advice. It was a survival instruction. A command from a man who had spent decades working alongside white men on the railroad, swallowing insults, ignoring slurs, keeping his head down so he could keep his job and feed his grandchildren. In Cheyenne in the 1920s and 30s, a black boy who could not read the unwritten rules of a white world would not survive it. Vernon learned. He conformed on the outside. He stored his anger somewhere deep inside where it could not be seen, and he kept moving. That marksmanship and that discipline would save his life on an Italian hillside 3 decades later. His grandmother Dora was confined to a wheelchair. The relationship between them was strained, sometimes hostile. After repeated conflicts at home, Vernon was sent to Father Flanagan's Boys Town orphanage in Omaha, Nebraska. He arrived at age 11 and stayed until he was 14, joining in sports and playing in the band, before returning to finish school and graduate from Clarinda High School in Clarinda, Iowa, his grandfather's hometown. After graduation, he worked on the Union Pacific Railroad during the summers, following his grandfather's path down the same steel tracks. He took whatever jobs he could find between seasons. Railroad porter, shoe shiner, sawmill worker, logger. He moved between Iowa and Washington state, drifting from job to job, town to town, never settling anywhere. None of it meant anything to him. He had no direction, no purpose, no future. He could see that a black man in 1930s, America was allowed to have. Then at Christmas 1939, his grandfather died of cancer. Vernon was 20 years old. The one person who had believed in him, who had shaped him, who had given him a rifle and a set of rules to live by, was gone. Baker was alone in a country that had already made clear what it thought of him. He once said that he had come in contact with many people who had no regard for a black face. Those were his own words. He needed something to hold on to. He needed a place where a man could prove what he was worth regardless of where he came from or what he looked like. He decided to join the United States Army. In April 1941, Vernon Baker walked into a recruiting office in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He told the sergeant he wanted to enlist as a quartermaster. The recruiting sergeant looked at him. The sergeant did not see a young man who could outshoot most soldiers in the entire army. He did not see a future combat officer. He did not see a man who would one day single-handedly destroy a German defensive position that had beaten back 3 previous assaults. He saw a black face, and he responded accordingly. The sergeant told Baker plainly, "We do not have any quotas for you people." Baker was turned away. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He left the office and walked back out into the Wyoming daylight. His grandfather had taught him how to conform. But conforming did not mean quitting. It never had. 2 months later, Baker walked into the same recruiting office. A different recruiter was on duty. This one processed his paperwork without comment. In the summer of 1941, 5 months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Private Vernon Baker enlisted in the United States Army. He had asked for the Quartermaster Corps. The Army assigned him to the infantry instead. He did not complain. He did not question it. He later said he did not say anything because he was going to get in. That was all that mattered. He was in. Baker was sent to Camp Walters, Texas, for basic training. It was his first time in the Deep South. Segregation hit him full in the face. His words: separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate training facilities, separate latrines, separate everything. The Army of the United States was preparing to fight a war against Adolf Hitler's doctrine of racial supremacy, while enforcing its own doctrine of racial supremacy against the men in its own ranks. After basic, Baker was posted to the 25th Infantry Regiment at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, a sprawling 19th-century cavalry post 15 miles north of the Mexican border in the Sonoran Desert. Fort Huachuca was where the Army kept its black soldiers, far from the major cities, far from the civilian population, far from the public eye. Out in the desert where nobody had to look at them or think about them, or consider what it meant that a democracy was fighting fascism with a segregated military. Baker thrived anyway. He was promoted to supply sergeant. He was selected for officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. On January 11, 1943, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, a black officer in an army that did not believe black men could lead, could fight, or could think under pressure. He was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, the only African-American infantry division that would see ground combat in Europe during the Second World War. Their motto was deeds, not words. Their reality was something else entirely. The 92nd Division had roughly 15,000 men. All of the enlisted soldiers were black. Nearly all of their senior officers were white. The Army had deliberately recruited these white officers from the South under the prevailing doctrine that Southerners knew how to handle black troops. The phrase was used without irony, handle, as though soldiers were livestock. The division commander was Major General Edward Almond, a Virginia Military Institute graduate who had risen through the ranks with powerful backing. Almond made no secret of his contempt for the men he commanded. He told one of his regiments that he had not sent for them. He said their Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends had insisted they see combat. He promised he would see to it that they received combat and their share of casualties. After the war, the 92nd Division's own official 1945 performance report described black officers as suffering from an inherent inferiority complex and a love of exhibitionism. In a separate 1953 interview, Almond stated openly that the white man is willing to die for patriotic reasons, and the Negro is not. He wrote that he understood their capabilities, and that he did not want to sit at the table with them. This was the commanding general of the only black infantry division in Europe. This was the man who controlled which awards recommendations moved forward and which ones disappeared. This was the wall between Vernon Baker and the Medal of Honor. Modern historians, including Daniel Gibran, Rick Atkinson, and Hondon Hargrove, have documented that the 92nd Division's battlefield difficulties had far more to do with Almond's poor leadership, inadequate training resources, and the placement of inexperienced replacements in critical positions than with any deficiency in the black soldiers themselves. Almond blamed his own failures on the men he had set up to fail. Baker and his fellow soldiers trained under these conditions. They knew what Almond thought of them. They knew what the army thought of them. They knew that the country they were preparing to die for considered them second-class citizens. They trained anyway. Baker later recalled that they were young and dumb and thought they were going to whip the Germans and drive them back home as soon as they got there. They believed in themselves. Nobody else had to. The 370th Infantry Regiment, Baker's unit, landed at Naples, Italy, in late July 1944. They were the first element of the 92nd Division to deploy overseas. The rest of the division arrived by September. The Buffalo soldiers were sent to the western, Tyrrhenian coast flank of the Italian peninsula, into the teeth of the Gothic line. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had ordered this massive defensive belt built across northern Italy using more than 15,000 slave laborers. They constructed over 2,000 fortified machine gun nests, concrete casemates, bunkers, observation posts, and artillery fighting positions. The Gothic line was one of the most heavily fortified positions on any front in the entire European war. It stretched from coast to coast, and the army sent the division it valued least to break through the western end of it. Baker saw combat immediately. On a night patrol in October 1944, he was wounded in the arm by shrapnel. He spent 2 months recovering at the 64th General Hospital in Pisa. He rejoined his unit in December along the Serchio Valley. On December 26, 1944, Baker witnessed an action that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lieutenant John Fox of the 366th Infantry, another black officer serving with the 92nd Division, was acting as a forward artillery observer in the hilltop village of Somocolonia when a massive German counterattack overran the position. Fox's observation post was being surrounded. He radioed his artillery battery and calmly called in fire on his own coordinates. The fire direction officer protested. That would mean firing on Fox's own position. Fox confirmed the order. He knew what he was doing. The shells came in. The village erupted. When the Allies retook Somocolonia, they found Fox's body amid the wreckage, along with the remains of approximately 100 German soldiers he had killed with his own death. Nobody wrote up a Medal of Honor recommendation for John Fox. Nobody wrote one for any black soldier who fought in the entire Second World War. In the entire conflict, 472 Medals of Honor were awarded. Not a single one went to an African American. Over 1.2 million black Americans served in uniform during the war. The Army's highest honor went to none of them. 0. The system was not broken. The system was working exactly as designed. By the spring of 1945, Baker had been promoted to first lieutenant and given command of the weapons platoon, Company C, 1st Battalion, 370th Infantry Regiment. He was a veteran now. He had seen friends die. He had been wounded and returned to the line. He had watched his own commanding general dismiss his men as cowards because of the color of their skin. He had watched John Fox call artillery onto himself and receive no recognition. Baker was still fighting, still in the mountains, still alive when many of the men he had trained with were not. The winter of 1944 to 1945 had been brutal. Rain turned the mountain trails to mud. The Apuan Alps above the Ligurian coast were not the gentle hills of Tuscany. They were steep, jagged, limestone ridges cut with deep ravines. Snow blanketed the peaks while cold rain lashed the valleys. The men lived in foxholes and makeshift shelters. They ate cold rations because fires drew mortar rounds. They rotated between the line and rest areas that offered little rest. Through all of it, the Buffalo soldiers held their sector. They patrolled. They fought. They took casualties, and they kept fighting. No one at Army headquarters acknowledged what they were accomplishing. No correspondent wrote about them. The newspapers back home barely mentioned the 92nd Division at all. These men fought in silence, for a country that preferred not to notice them. The objective on April 5, 1945, was Castle Aghinolfi, a medieval mountain fortress perched on the high ground of the Apuan Alps that the Germans had converted into a fortified artillery observation strongpoint. It overlooked the coastal highway near the town of Massa, commanding the terrain for miles in every direction. The castle sat about 2 miles from the 370th line of departure. 3 previous Allied attempts to take it had failed with heavy casualties. Each time, the attacking force had been stopped by the interlocking network of concealed machine gun positions, camouflaged dugouts, hidden observation posts, and pre-registered mortar and artillery targets the Germans had built into the surrounding hillsides. Anything that moved on those slopes was spotted, targeted, and killed. The triangle of death. Baker's platoon drew the assignment. Roughly 70% of his 25 men were green replacements with no combat experience. They had arrived as fillers, bodies to replace the casualties the division had been absorbing for months. They had never heard a bullet crack past their heads. They did not know the sound of a German MG-42, that distinctive ripping cloth noise that meant someone was about to die. Baker knew every one of those sounds. He knew the delay between the flash of a mortar launch and the impact of the round. He knew what it felt like to have the man beside you suddenly go silent. And he knew that most of his inexperienced replacements would discover these realities for the first time within the next few hours. Baker was awakened at 3 a.m. He discarded his standard steel combat helmet. It sat heavy on his head, and it deafened him. On a mountainside in the dark, surrounded by concealed enemy positions, he needed to hear everything. Every twig snap, every metallic click of a weapon being charged, every whispered German command. He pulled on a wool helmet liner instead. By one account, he put on his dress uniform underneath his field jacket. If Vernon Baker was going to die on that Italian hillside, he wanted to go up sharp, looking like a soldier, looking like the man the army had never wanted him to be. At 0500 hours, Baker advanced at the head of his weapons platoon alongside Company C's 3 rifle platoons. They moved uphill through the darkness, through terrain that was steep, rocky, and covered with low Mediterranean scrub that tore at their uniforms and hands. Baker moved faster than the rest of the company. He was small, quick, silent. His grandfather had taught him to move through brush without disturbing it, to place his feet on rock instead of leaf, to become part of the terrain instead of moving across it. Those childhood hunting lessons in Wyoming were combat skills now. Within 2 hours, Baker and about 25 men had reached the south side of a draw, approximately 250 yards from the castle walls. They had covered roughly 3,000 yards of enemy territory. They were deep behind German lines, far too deep for the rest of the company to keep pace. And now they were completely alone on the mountainside with no support behind them and the full weight of a German defensive network above them. Baker scouted ahead for a position to set up his platoon's machine gun. He noticed 2 cylindrical objects protruding from a narrow slit in a hillside mount. Telescope optics. A German observation post, concealed and camouflaged so carefully that it was invisible from more than a few feet away. The observers inside that post could call artillery fire onto any movement they detected across the entire valley below. One radio call from that slit and Baker's platoon would be buried under German shells. Baker dropped to his stomach. He crawled beneath the opening, positioning himself directly under the slit where the observers could not depress their optics low enough to see him. He raised his M1 Garand rifle, jammed the barrel into the slit, and emptied the 8-round clip into the darkness. Both German observers were killed instantly. The observation post went silent. No radio call went out. Baker's platoon was still invisible. He moved forward through the brush. Within minutes, he stumbled onto a camouflaged machine gun nest. 2 German soldiers sat behind a mounted weapon, eating breakfast. Bread and field rations spread across the sandbags. They had heard nothing. They never finished the meal. Baker raised his rifle and shot both of them before either man could swing the machine gun around. 2 more Germans dead. 2 more positions eliminated. If you want to know what he did next, please like this video. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard of Vernon Baker, and he deserves to be heard. Please subscribe. Back to Baker, on that hillside. Captain John Runyon, Company C's white commanding officer, finally caught up to Baker's position. Runyon had only joined the unit weeks earlier in March 1945 as a replacement officer. He had been assigned to lead black troops under the Army's segregation policy. He had no relationship with these men. No shared training, no shared deprivation, no bond forged under fire. He was a stranger commanding men he did not know in terrain he had never fought in. A German soldier suddenly appeared from concealment, just yards away. The man's arm was already in motion. He hurled a potato masher stick grenade directly at Baker and Runyon. The grenade struck Runyon's steel helmet with a metallic clang, bounced off, and landed in the dirt between the two Americans. Time stopped. The fuse should have detonated on impact. It did not. A dud. In his panic, Runyon lurched sideways and knocked Baker's rifle off its target. Baker recovered in under 2 seconds. He steadied the Garand, acquired the fleeing German soldier, scrambling up the rocky slope, and fired twice. The man dropped and did not move. Baker had saved both their lives. Runyon said nothing. Baker pushed forward alone. He found a concealed dugout built into the hillside, its entrance hidden behind scrub brush and packed earth. He could hear voices inside. German voices. Baker pulled the pin on a hand grenade and threw it at the entrance. The blast blew the camouflaged door apart. Smoke and pulverized dirt erupted from the opening. A German soldier stumbled out of the dust cloud, coughing, arms raised against the light. Baker shot him. He did not hesitate. He pulled the pin on a second grenade and threw it deep into the darkness of the dugout. The detonation shook the hillside. Then Baker entered the dugout, firing his submachine gun. The muzzle flash lit up the cramped interior in short orange bursts. 2 more German soldiers fell in the confined space. Baker stepped over their bodies and climbed back out into the morning air, covered in dust and the smell of cordite. In the space of roughly 90 minutes, First Lieutenant Vernon Baker had personally killed 9 enemy soldiers. He had destroyed 3 machine gun positions, 1 observation post, and 1 dugout. He had accomplished this essentially alone, moving from position to position with his rifle, submachine gun, and grenades. A 140-pound man, 5 feet 5 inches tall, had torn a hole through German defences that 3 previous full-strength Allied assaults had failed to penetrate. Then the Germans recovered. Mortar rounds began falling among Baker's 25 men on the exposed hillside. High explosive shells detonated against the rocks, sending shrapnel scything through the platoon. Machine gun fire from higher positions raked the slope in crisscrossing arcs. The casualties were catastrophic and immediate. Men who had never experienced combat were dying in their first firefight, cut down before they could find cover. Within minutes, roughly 2/3 of the 25-man group were killed or wounded. Bodies lay scattered across the rocky ground. The wounded screamed for medics who were not there. Baker grabbed his radio and called the Fire Direction Center, requesting artillery support on the German positions above him. The center refused. They did not believe any American unit could have penetrated that far behind enemy lines. Baker's reported coordinates were impossible. No artillery support came. Baker was completely on his own, with a handful of survivors, 2 miles behind enemy lines, under mortar and machine gun fire on an open hillside. Baker found Captain Runyon sheltering behind a rock outcrop. He told Runyon he needed the rest of the company to move forward and reinforce the position. Runyon looked at the carnage. He looked at the bodies on the slope. He told Baker he was going back to get reinforcements. Baker looked at the man. He knew. Every combat soldier knows the look, the eyes that have already left the fight. The body just needs time to follow. Baker told Runyon they would be there when he got back. Runyon turned and walked down the hill. He disappeared into the haze of smoke, shell bursts, and settling dust. He never returned. Baker later said he was angry and aghast that Runyon never came back. He did not learn the full truth until the fighting was over. Runyon had reached the battalion command post and reported that Baker's platoon had been wiped out, destroyed. No survivors. Do not bother sending reinforcements. They are finished. The battalion commander accepted this report. No help was dispatched. No artillery was redirected to support Baker's position. No medics were sent forward. Vernon Baker and his surviving men had been written off by their own army, left on a German mountain to die. The aftermath for Runyon is one of the most infuriating details in this story. Despite abandoning his platoon during combat and falsely reporting them destroyed, Captain John Runyon was decorated twice for the action on April 5, 1945. He received the Silver Star under 92nd Infantry Division General Orders, number 53, 1945. He then received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest valor decoration in the United States Army, under War Department General Orders, number 16, February 8, 1946. The Distinguished Service Cross citation credited Runyon with heroically leading his company 2 miles into German lines and personally accounting for the destruction of 6 machine gun positions, 4 dugouts, and 2 observation posts. Those were Baker's platoon's achievements: Baker's grenades, Baker's rifle, Baker's 9 kills, attributed on paper to the man who walked away. The white officer who abandoned the fight received 2 Valor Awards. The black officer who won the fight received nothing for over half a century. None of this was known to Baker on that April morning. He only knew that reinforcements were not coming. His 25 men were reduced to 8. Some of his casualties had been killed in a way that filled Baker with cold rage. German soldiers had put on Red Cross armbands and approached Baker's wounded men pretending to be medics. Then they killed them. Baker had a choice to make. He could try to hold the position and die in place, or he could get his surviving men off that mountain alive. Baker chose his men. The withdrawal would happen in 2 groups. For the first group, the walking wounded, Baker personally provided covering fire. Men who could still move but were bleeding from shrapnel wounds, clutching broken limbs, stumbling over rocks. Baker fired his rifle at the German positions to keep them suppressed while his wounded men moved down the slope. When the first group was clear, he stayed for the second, the more seriously wounded who had to be dragged and carried. During the second group's retreat, with covering fire from a single platoon member, Baker crawled forward toward 2 machine gun positions they had bypassed on the way up. These guns were now between his men and safety. If the Germans opened fire, the retreating wounded would be massacred. Baker pulled the pins on his remaining grenades and destroyed both positions. He followed each blast with aimed rifle fire. The path was clear. He got his men off that mountain. Of his original 25, 19 did not come back. Baker gathered their dog tags from the bodies of the men who could be reached. He carried them down the slope, metal tags with stamped names. 19 of them. When he reached regimental headquarters to turn in those tags, the regimental commander, Colonel Sherman, did not ask about the 19 dead. He did not ask about the 9 Germans Baker had killed or the fortified positions he had destroyed. Colonel Sherman looked at First Lieutenant Vernon Baker and chewed him out for not wearing a regulation steel helmet. Baker said nothing. His grandfather had taught him how to conform. Vernon Baker conformed, and he remembered. The following night, April 6th, the army needed someone to lead a battalion advance back up through enemy minefields and heavy fire toward Castle Aghinolfi. Baker volunteered. He had already been up that mountain. He knew where the mines were. He knew where the dead lay. He led the advance in darkness with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to prove. When they reached the fortress, it was empty. The Germans had abandoned Castle Aghinolfi during the night. Baker's one-man assault the previous morning had broken the German will to hold the position. The destruction he inflicted convinced their command that the defences were compromised. They withdrew under cover of darkness. The mountain strongpoint that had swallowed 3 Allied assaults and killed hundreds of soldiers fell without a final shot, because of what Vernon Baker did alone on that hillside. For his actions on April 5 and 6, 1945, Baker was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross at a ceremony in Genoa on July 4, 1945. Just over 5,000 of these decorations were awarded during the entire Second World War. Baker had reportedly been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork never advanced past the division level. It stopped at General Amman's desk. The general, who believed black soldiers were genetically incapable of heroism, made certain that no evidence of black heroism reached Washington. Baker was not told about the recommendation. He would not learn the truth for decades. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. American forces returned home. The 92nd Division was deactivated. Baker stayed in Italy on occupation duty until February 1947, then re-enlisted. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, he volunteered for combat. After President Truman's Executive Order 9981 desegregated the armed forces in 1948, Baker became one of the first black officers to command an all-white company. He became a paratrooper and served with airborne units, including the 11th Airborne Division. He jumped out of aircraft until he was 48 years old. He retired from the United States Army in 1968 after 27 continuous years of service. After retirement, Baker spent more than 20 years working for the American Red Cross at Fort Ord, California, counseling military families. He served during the Vietnam era. After his second wife, Fern, died in 1986, Baker moved to a small property near St. Marie's in the mountains of northern Idaho. The landscape reminded him of the Wyoming of his childhood. He hunted elk in the autumn forests. He fished the clear mountain streams. He kept a garden. He married Heidi Paulik, a German-born woman, in 1993. Neighbors in St. Marie's knew him as a polite, quiet man who wore flannel shirts and drove an old truck. Most had no idea they were living near one of the most decorated combat soldiers in American history. Baker did not advertise it. He did not hang medals on his wall for visitors to admire. He had spent 27 years in the army and nearly 20 years with the Red Cross. He had given enough. He wanted silence and trees and the sound of elk moving through timber at dawn. In his mid-70s, he killed a mountain lion that had been stalking him near his home. The boy whose grandfather gave him a rifle at 12 and told him never to waste a shot had not lost his aim. Baker carried no bitterness. He had every right to carry enough bitterness to crush a man. But he refused. In his memoir, Lasting Valor, he wrote that the army had treated them as if war were plantation work and fighting Germans were picking cotton. He acknowledged how harsh those words sounded. Then he wrote that he could not work up much bitterness anymore. He even found a way to understand Runyon. He wrote that if he had been in Runyon's position, he too might have left. Runyon was not a Buffalo Soldier. He was a white man who could leave with honor when the odds became overwhelming. The Buffalo Soldiers did not have that option. They had to fight to the last man just to retain any shred of dignity. That distinction, written without anger, says more about the segregated army than any historian's analysis ever could. For 50 years, nobody investigated. The absence of a single Black Medal of Honor recipient from the Second World War sat undisturbed in the historical record like an unexploded shell. Over 1.2 million Black Americans served. 472 Medals of Honor were awarded during the war. Not one went to a black soldier. The silence lasted half a century. In 1993, the Army finally acted. Under pressure from the Congressional Black Caucus, Acting Secretary of the Army John Shannon commissioned Shaw University, a historically black college in Raleigh, North Carolina, to investigate whether racial discrimination had affected Medal of Honor recommendations during the Second World War. The Army awarded the Shaw team $325,000 for the study. Dr. Daniel Gibran, a professor of international relations born in Guyana, led the research alongside a team of distinguished military historians, including Richard Cohn, the former chief historian of the United States Air Force. Gibran's team spent 2 years in the archives. They reviewed unit histories, after-action reports, award recommendations, and chain-of-command records. They traced the path a Medal of Honor nomination would have had to follow, from platoon leader to company commander to battalion to regiment to division headquarters to Washington. They found the path had been blocked at every turn. Their conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. Not a single African-American soldier had ever been formally nominated for the Medal of Honor during the entire war. The recommendations were either never written by white commanding officers who did not believe black soldiers were capable of heroism, or were written and then killed at the division level by commanders like Almond. Gibran summed it up in one word: racism. The study recommended 10 cases for upgrade to the Medal of Honor. In October 1996, Congress passed Public Law 104201, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 1997. Section 561 specifically waived the statutory time limit that had prevented these awards from being granted. An Army Board of Generals reviewed the files with all racial identifiers stripped from the paperwork. They selected 7. On January 13, 1997, in the East Room of the White House, the United States Marine Corps Band played as President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers from the Second World War. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, Jr. First Lieutenant John Fox, the man Baker had watched call artillery onto his own position at Somocolonia. Private First Class Willie James, Jr. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. First Lieutenant Charles Thomas. Private George Watson, and First Lieutenant Vernon Joseph Baker. Baker was the only one still alive. The other 6 had died years or decades earlier. Their medals were placed into the hands of widows, sons, daughters, and grandchildren who had grown up knowing their father or grandfather was a hero but had never seen the nation acknowledge it. Baker stood in the White House at 77 years old, wearing his dress uniform with decades of service ribbons across his chest. The East Room was packed. Senators, generals, historians, journalists, and the families of 6 dead soldiers filled every seat. Some of the family members were elderly themselves, sons and daughters who had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. Others were grandchildren who had only heard the stories secondhand. The Marine Corps band played. Cameras flashed. The President of the United States stood at a podium and prepared to correct a wrong that was older than half the people in the room. Clinton told the room that these men were denied the nation's highest honor, but their deeds could not be denied. He said now and forever, the truth would be known about these African Americans who gave so much that the rest of us might be free. In the receiving line, Clinton asked Baker about a different kind of fight. In the mid-1990s, Baker had been stalked by a mountain lion near his Idaho property. He killed it. Clinton asked what became of the animal. Baker looked at the President of the United States and told him the mountain lion was in his freezer and he planned to eat it. The room erupted in laughter. The 77-year-old Medal of Honor recipient was still the same boy from Cheyenne. Every shot brings home meat, no round wasted. Baker stepped forward to receive the medal. A lone tear rolled down his cheek. He did not speak during the ceremony. Afterward, he told reporters that he had been thinking about what happened up on that hill that day. Years later, in a PBS interview, Baker finally put words to what he had carried inside. He said he was an old soldier and was not supposed to be crying. He said it was 19 men that he left over in Italy who could not be there with him. He said without them, without 4 of those men in particular, he probably would not be standing there himself. He said everybody calls him a hero. But those men, the 19 who never left that mountain, they were the heroes. Asked afterward whether he was bitter about the 52-year wait, Baker said the honor should have come a long time ago. He said if he was worthy of the Medal of Honor in 1945, he should have received it then. But he said that receiving the honor now meant that every black soldier who fought in the Second World War had been vindicated, every single one of them. He also said he was an angry young man once, and that they were all angry, but they had a job to do, and they did it. He said he knew things would get better, and he was glad to say he was there to see it. Vernon Joseph Baker died of brain cancer at his home south of St. Maries, Idaho, on July 13, 2010. He was 90 years old. His ashes were interred at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 59, Grave 4408, on September 24, 2010, with full military honors. 5 Medal of Honor recipients, all Vietnam veterans, attended the ceremony. Tom Norris, Robert Foley, Brian Thacker, Joe Marm, and Barney Barnum came forward one by one to lay a yellow rose beside Baker's urn, then stepped back and saluted. He had also received the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star during his career, and in 2008 the Sandor Tesla Award for Moral Courage from Wofford College. In 2006, 3 blocks of Main Street in Clarinda, Iowa, the town where Baker graduated high school, were renamed Vernon J. Baker Medal of Honor Main Street. A bronze statue stands in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in the city where a recruiting sergeant once told him his people were not wanted. Baker left behind his memoir, Lasting Valor, co-written with journalist Ken Olson, with a foreword by General Colin Powell. In it, he wrote 5 principles that guided his life. Give respect before you expect it. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Remember the mission. Set the example. Keep going. 5 rules, simple enough for a boy to follow, strong enough for a soldier to live by. The final words of his memoir were not about medals. They were not about vindication. They were not about the 52 years of silence. Baker wrote that the Buffalo Soldiers fought fiercely and proudly for a country that shunned them. He said they kept fighting because they knew the price of allowing Nazi fascism to rule was far greater than even what they endured at home. Then he wrote something that only a man who had crawled through the blood and smoke of real combat could have written. For the sake of his 19 comrades, he hoped no man, black, white, or any color, would ever again have the opportunity to earn the Medal of Honor, because war is not honor. That is the story of Vernon Baker. Most people have never heard his name. A recruiting sergeant told him his people were not wanted. His commanding general called his race inferior. His company commander abandoned him on a German mountain and was decorated twice for Baker's achievements. His country denied him its highest recognition for over half a century. Through all of it, Vernon Baker never stopped, not fighting, not serving, not believing that the country he bled for would one day see him for what he was. That is where you come in. Hit that like button right now. Not for us, for him. Every like sends this video to someone who has never heard the name Vernon Baker. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. We dig through military archives, through official records, through Medal of Honor citations to find men like Baker, men who were forgotten, men who were denied, men whose stories sat in filing cabinets for decades while the world moved on. We pull those stories out and tell them every week. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, anywhere on the planet. We have viewers on every continent. Every one of you is part of this. Every comment, every share, every like keeps these stories from disappearing. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us their name. Tell us their branch. This comment section is not just a comment section. It is a roll call, and every name matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that First Lieutenant Vernon Baker finally gets what a recruiting sergeant in Cheyenne, Wyoming told him he would never have. Recognition, respect, and a place in history.